Hello and welcome to Portal to the Past, a short history podcast to teach you about important historical events that are often left outside of the school curriculum. I'm Evie and I'm currently studying history at A-level. Today we're going to be talking about the Overbury Affair, which was one of the biggest scandals under James I. At the time of James I's ruling, there were two powerful families known as the Howards and the Devereux. But in order to unify the divisions that were prevalent between these two families, there was a marriage that was arranged. Lady Frances Howard, who was only 14, was married to Robert Devereux, who was only 13. It was a political marriage and both held no real regard for the other, but it was purely just to unite these two families. They were also kept separate after the marriage, so it was never consummated, which is an important fact in this affair. This was important because it was a key fact that allowed Howard to marry her true love, Robert Carr, or otherwise known as the first Earl of Somerset. This was someone who she had chosen after not holding real regard for her first husband. In order to do this, she had multiple doctors prove that the marriage was never consummated by proving her own virginity, and this allowed her to get her marriage annulled. However, there is a bit of a conspiracy here, as when the doctors were proving this fact, she specifically asked to be concealed so the doctors couldn't directly see her. And this did make some suspicious, as they suggested that perhaps she'd got her sister to take place and that the marriage had been consummated, but she knew that she needed this, so some suggested it was faked. However, on the 25th of September 1613, James I granted the annulment, and this was particularly as the Earl of Somerset was a favourite of James I. On the 26th of December that same year, Francis and Somerset were married. This is where Sir Thomas Overbury comes in, as you might be wondering why I haven't mentioned him yet, considering this is called the Overbury Affair. Overbury was a friend of Somerset's, and he'd taken the stance that the marriage shouldn't have occurred and Somerset shouldn't have married Howard. He was, in fact, one of the principal opposition members to the marriage. This was arguably a big mistake for him to make, though, because the Howards were extremely powerful and wealthy at this time, so this perhaps wasn't the wisest choice for him to do. Clearly, Howard wasn't going to be happy with this, and she convinced James to ask Overbury to take the position of the Russian ambassador for England. This was quite clever of her because she knew that Overbury wouldn't accept it. He wouldn't want to do the move. And therefore, she knew that he was going to turn it down. And inevitably, he did turn the position down, playing exactly into Howard's hands. However, James I was deeply offended by this. He was the King of England after all, and for someone to refuse his wishes, I'm sure he would not have been used to that. And as a result of this, Overbury was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and it was here that he died as a result of poisoning. For a while, little was heard of this affair. It seemed pretty straightforward at this moment. Howard and Somerset remained married, and Overbury was dead, so clearly he was going to provide no more opposition. However, 18 months after Overbury's death, an apothecary in Yorkshire on his deathbed decided to confess that Howard had bribed him to give her poisons. These same poisons are the ones that he claimed were used to murder Overbury. And this clearly highlighted that the death of Overbury wasn't as clearly straightforward as it perhaps initially seemed. After King James I was notified, following investigations found out that Howard had been trying to put poison in Overbury's food for a prolonged period of time. She'd thought this was perhaps a good way to get to him by poisoning his food. However, Richard Weston, who was Overbury's keeper while he was in the Tower of London, had been stealthily intercepting the food. He decided not to report Howard directly, as he was aware of how powerful they were, and perhaps he realised the mistake that Overbury had made in openly opposing them. So he decided to not officially report the attempts to smuggle poison in, and instead he just continued to try and intercept her attempts to kill Overbury. Further investigations then highlighted that it was actually Mrs. Ann Turner, who was Howard's waiting woman, that had given Weston the poison. Not Weston, had given Overbury the poison, and which had led to his death. This obviously just detracted suspicion away from Howard, because it wasn't a direct attempt from her. So this is probably why she used Ann Turner to do it. In October 1615, Howard and Somerset were arrested for their involvement in the murder. These revelations had made it clear that it was a murder, and therefore that is why they were arrested. In addition, all the accessories to the crime, so including the people I've just mentioned, including the apothecary, the guard, and the waiting woman, were all hanged. Howard eventually admitted to her involvement in the Overbury murder, but Somerset continued to claim his innocence, claiming he wasn't involved with it and, he was innocent. But this was actually later found to be false. It later became clear that he'd burnt documents that would have incriminated Howard, and he'd burnt them obviously to protect her. And therefore he was also found guilty of being an accomplice to the crime. And this judgment was passed in 1616. Initially, for this blatant conspiracy to murder Overbury, the couple both received a death sentence for their crime. However, James I personally intervened in this, and he just changed their sentence to be life imprisonment in the Tower. But instead, they were actually pardoned, and they were released in 1622. Therefore, this is a clear demonstration of the scandals and conspiracies that occurred throughout this tumultuous affair. One of the key conspiracies surrounding this is why all the accomplices were killed, but the main instigators, Howard and Somerset, who, arguably were the most guilty, that instigated the whole thing, received very little punishment overall, not very long imprisonment at all, and they escaped their death penalty. It had been widely reported, it has been recorded now, that James I had homosexual tendencies, and there are reports of him having relationships, to put it in that way, with some of his male courtiers. And it's possible that Somerset was perhaps admired by James in this way, and although they maybe didn't have like a fully fledged relationship in this way, James I was partial to him. He was one of his favourites, you might say. And this was perhaps the cause for their pardon. There is debate as to the extent of whether this is true, but in my opinion, which again, as I've mentioned in my previous podcast, you don't have to take at all, it isn't professional, but I personally think this does seem plausible. The records of James I having these tendencies suggest that this could have been a motive in releasing them, and there doesn't seem to be many other motives as to why they would be released, because obviously they did instigate a murder and everyone else was hung, so why wouldn't they? Another question that can kind of be raised in regard to this situation, perhaps not a conspiracy, but more a matter of opinion, is how much we can actually blame Howard for her behaviour. Obviously, I'm not excusing the murder. It is condemnable. It is not good behaviour. But in terms of how much you can argue that there's sympathy felt for her in regard to the first marriage that she was forced into that ultimately catalysed all these events. Personally, again, my opinion isn't professional, but I do feel some sympathy for her. She was forced into a marriage that she didn't like, the other person. And then when she did find someone that she loved and she wanted to marry, can we really blame her for wanting to make that choice? Also, kind of the extent that she went to get her marriage annulled was certainly, it shows strength of character and power of a Jacobean woman that obviously wasn't particularly stereotypical, with women being expected to be subservient to men, hold little power, and just kind of do as they're told. So this kind of bold display of going against what she was forced into and choosing what she honestly wanted to do, for me, is almost admirable, because, it's not normal behaviour. Even if she does come from a very powerful family, it's still unusual behaviour for a Jacobean woman. So some may argue that actually we can kind of feel sympathy as to that part of it. Obviously, though, that perhaps doesn't extend to the entire Overbury affair, because, you know, it does lead to murdering another man who really just opposed the annulment. But then again, if she really did think that he was going to be a threat to be forced back into that marriage, you could kind of see that I hesitate to say understand, but along the lines, kind of see where she was coming from, although obviously the murder isn't excusable. The final thing I actually wanted to discuss about the Overbury affair is slightly off topic, but it's actually in relation to Shakespeare, who was, as many of you will know, at his peak during the Jacobean period. While the two plays that I'm about to mention and discuss in relation to this affair were actually written before the event, so it obviously isn't direct links between them, it's still interesting to consider the parallels between the Overbury affair and Shakespeare's work. So first of all, I want to talk about Romeo and Juliet, obviously one of Shakespeare's most famous plays. Everyone knows the story. It's, you know, the split between the two powerful families, the Montagues and the Capulets, and obviously it's a tragedy, so they do both die. But I think we can kind of look at the similarities between the idea of the divisions between these two families in Shakespeare's play, and also the divisions between Howard's family and her first husband's family, which I think is interesting. In addition to this, looking at another of Shakespeare's plays here, this time Othello, we could argue that the Machiavellian nature, which, if you don't know what that means, it's basically power hungry, you might say. So the Machiavellian nature of Howard's plot could arguably be seen to have similarities with some of Shakespeare's tragic antagonists. And the one that came to mind for me was actually Iago as Othello, as the antagonist in Shakespeare's play Othello. And it came to mind because I'm actually studying this as part of my A-levels, but also I do think it is a very good comparison to make. Iago certainly embodies the typical Machiavellian villain, and he devises an extensive murderous plot for revenge on his superior, Othello. And this does involve manipulating a whole host of people around him. And ultimately, large amounts of the people that he does manipulate do either die or get wounded, and eventually he doesn't really care for them, or he just uses them all for his own gain. And it's interesting to consider how much of a similarity can therefore be drawn between Howard's plot. I mean, it was Machiavellian in her nature. She's removing someone who posed a threat to her position, and also she did manipulate people to get the plot done, and those people were punished while she wasn't. And although Iago is obviously punished at the end of Othello, the kind of overall themes within the two plots are certainly similar. So as I mentioned, these aren't direct links, as the plays actually were written before Shakespeare, before the Overbury affair. But I think what I found interesting about this was that we can consider then how this highlights that Shakespeare's plays weren't merely just brilliant fiction, and they're actually chilling portrayals of arguably some of the darkest parts of Jacobean history. So I hope you've enjoyed this podcast on the Overbury affair. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the events and also the analysis and links to literary works at the end. Please check out my channel for more podcasts. They should be appearing regularly now. This is my second one, but feel free to check out my last podcast, which was about Agrippina in ancient Rome. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed.